Welcome to Seeking the Lost with Earl Barnett. This program is sponsored by some area churches of Christ and is dedicated to spreading the everlasting gospel as revealed in the Holy Scriptures. The churches of Christ accept the Scriptures as totally inspired of God and the all-sufficient guide for faith and practice. Therefore, they reject all doctrines of men and rely totally on the Bible to direct their course in serving God. It is our pledge to you that each lesson will be the truth as revealed in His holy word. Mr. Barnett carefully prepares the graphics so you can clearly see the book, chapter, and verse of each lesson taught. We urge you to either copy the scriptures used or record this program for further study. If you have any questions or comments, or if you need prayer, the Seeking the Lost ministry can be reached toll-free at 1-800-390-7734. It is our prayer that Seeking the Lost will be an important source of information about God's Word and will help you more perfectly worship Him. And now, here is Mr. Barnett.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to the Seeking the Lost broadcast. You can hardly hear anyone speak today on television or perhaps even from the pulpit that they don't start talking about the end times. There's a lot of end time preaching going on today. And of course, all of us know that we don't know when the Lord is going to come back. But there's a lot of speculation today that people pick up different passages and they look at different headlines and they say, this is a sure sign that we're living in the end times. Well, my friends, I don't know if we're living in the end times or not. I do know this, that the Lord is coming back. And as far as Him revealing when He's coming back, He hasn't done that. As far as giving us any signs as when He's coming back, He hasn't done that either. Because as we'll see throughout this particular lesson, we're going to see that when the Lord comes back, He'll come back unexpectedly. So I want to talk to you, though, about the end time prophecies. And especially today, we're going to focus on Matthew 24. This is an important chapter in the Bible, and it's a happy hunting ground of those who really don't understand it. Somebody might say, well, you seem presumptuous to declare that you understand Matthew 24 and somebody else doesn't. Well, I want to tell you something. For a time, I didn't understand Matthew 24, and I was trying to fit the passages and whatever was said there in the end times prophecies of things that were going to happen before the end of the world. But then I began to study and got some lessons from people that were smarter than I, and I began to see it had nothing to do with the end of the times, the end of the world prophecies. And you might be surprised with that, but let's study it together. The scriptures do speak of the end of the world, but many of the verses are being misinterpreted. For instance, Matthew 24 and Mark recorded the same incidents in Mark 13 and Luke 21. Described the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, not the end of the world. And as I first started studying the scriptures, I thought it was talking about mostly the end of the world. But we're going to see, and I think that if you'll bear with me and be patient, I can show you that these chapters do not talk about the end of the world, but rather the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, 1 through 34, we're going to read it. And that's the only way that I knew to get it before you. It's a lengthy reading, but I think we can get through it fairly easily. We're going to go through the first 34 verses. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to show Him the buildings of the temple. And He made a very startling announcement because He said, do you see all these things? Assuredly I say to you that not one stone shall be left here upon another. Not one. And shall not be thrown down. In other words, the temple is going to be destroyed. It's going to be thrown down. Now, every Jew at that time and age were very proud of the temple, and they should have been. It wasn't the original temple that was built in the Old Testament, but it was built upon the ruins of that temple. But they were very proud of that temple. It was a magnificent structure. And Jesus said it was going to be torn down. Now, you remember that Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, and that temple, this passage here, was literally fulfilled in 70 AD when Titus, the Roman general, that he successfully conquered Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple. They brought it to the ground. But he said that was going to happen. The Jews then didn't understand it. And even his disciples didn't understand it, but he said it's going to happen. Now, as they sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age." I want you to notice here something very important. The sign of your coming. What is he talking about? He's talking about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ in his vengeance upon the Jewish nations for rejecting him. It's not talking about the second coming of Jesus when he's going to judge the world there. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." He's warning them, and this, let's just say, it's just before he was crucified, and let's say it's either 32 or 33 AD, and that would be some 27 years before the temple was actually destroyed. In the meantime, he says, now don't be deceived, because there's going to be many false prophets arise. They're going to say that they are Christ. He said, you'll hear wars and rumors of wars. He said, don't be troubled about that, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. What are you talking about? What are the signs of your coming and the end of the age, or the end of the world? And so Jesus is talking about when those things are going to be fulfilled, when every stone will be thrown down. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdoms. There shall be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes at various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. I want you to think about that for a moment. Because today, when there is a major eruption, when there's war somewhere, you know that the end-time preachers get up and that's just fodder for their cannon. They'll get up and they say, oh, it's coming. The end of time is coming. I've been reading up, and it's very close. They don't know that. And here is showing you very plainly that the famines, the pestilence, the earthquakes, the wars and the rumors of wars are not a sign of his coming. And people overlook that, as I overlooked it. And so I'm trying to help you as I was helped. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. You remember the church was persecuted. You will be hated of all nations. Many will be offended and will betray one another. You'll hate one another. Many false prophets will arise up and deceive many. We're still in Matthew 24. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Yes, that could describe our age, sure. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Here's something. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Somebody said, that's the end of the world. I was talking to a young man one time, and he was very sincere, and he said, Jesus is coming soon, had a sign up. I said, how do you know Jesus is coming soon? And he said, well, all of these wars and all of these things that are happening, and the gospel's been preached to the world. I said, you know, the gospel has been preached to the world. It was preached to the world in the first century, and that is true. The first century Christians carried the gospel to the whole world. You remember the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul and those of the Apostle Peter? You remember that they were scattered abroad and went everywhere preaching the gospel? You remember that on the day of Pentecost, all of those people that were there, and they went back home and carrying the gospel message with them? And that is the truth, that they carried the gospel to all the nations. And that is what this is talking about here. And I want to say this in passing, that, you know, we ought to be ashamed, and I think God is going to hold us accountable, because just think of the ways that we have of carrying the gospel to the world. The radio, the television, the telephones, the mails, the internet. We have so many means of communication. Are we carrying the gospel to the world? Well, they did it without any of those things in one generation. Something to think about. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world. When? Well, that's before the temple is going to be destroyed. But it's coming down. It's coming down. Now then, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, you go back and you'll see that Daniel spoke of that particular time when he talks about the people of the prince, that they will come. And they did take the city. And he said, standing in the holy place, he said, whoever reads now, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee into the mountains. You know, that should have given me a clue a long time ago. That should have given me a clue. It's not talking about the end of the world. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. At the end of the world, there are no mountains to flee to. That should have given me a clue long before I learned about it. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. He that is in the field not go back to get his clothes. It's not going to matter. Is it at the end of the world? Well, this is not talking about the end of the world. It's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But woe unto them who are pregnant in those days, who are nursing babies in those days. It's going to be especially hard on mothers who have babies in arms. It's going to be especially hard. Just pray that it don't happen then. And pray that your flight not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. All of these things are going to complicate your retreat and your escape out of Jerusalem. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not has been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Great tribulation is going to come upon this nation. Did you know that it did? It actually did. I was reading a commentary before in preparing of this sermon, and they began to enumerate the different places where that the slaughter took place, that the Romans came in and they slaughtered, and they killed so many people. 500,000 here, 300,000 there, and just on and on and on till it amounted up to over 1 million people died when Jerusalem fell. And so it was a horrific slaughter. Be a great tribulation. You know, there's a false doctrine that is going around in the world today that has to do with the tribulation. That Jesus is going to come back secretly and he's going to take out the church, take out the good people and keep them out of the world for 7 years. And there's going to be 7 years of tribulation on the earth. And then he's going to come back and fight a great war. That is a false doctrine. We'll talk about that one later. But there will be great tribulation. Is that where you get your doctrine? It's talking about the fall and destruction of Jerusalem back there in the first century. Unless those days are shortened, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be saved or shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, don't you believe it? Or there, don't believe it, for false Christ and false prophets will arise. They're still with us today. They're still with us today. And show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And then he said, see, I have told you beforehand. I've told you now what's going to happen. So we go on. Therefore I say unto you, look, he is in the desert. Don't you go out there. Or look, he is in the inner room. Don't you believe it? For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes at the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, you won't have to guess. You won't have to guess, because when I'm coming in the vengeance upon the Jewish nation for the way that they rejected me, when I'm coming, they will know it. For wheresoever the carcass is, there the eagles will gather together. And so he says, you don't have to say, oh, he's out there, he's coming out of the desert, he's in the inner chamber. Don't you believe it? Because as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, they'll know when I get there. Won't be any question about it. And again, immediately after the tribulation those days, the sun will be darkened. Somebody says, those are terrible times to come. Wait a minute now. And the moon will not give its light, and the stars of heaven will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and then will the other tribes of the earth mourn. All the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. What is all of this? Oh, it's the second coming of Christ. No, my friends, it is the coming of vengeance of destruction upon Jerusalem and Judah. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Somebody says, I don't believe that. What about all this figurative language here, and what does it mean? If you'll remember that oftentimes in the Bible, that the celestial bodies were used to denote earthly things. For instance, do you remember the dreams of Joseph? What did he dream? Well, he dreamed that the sun and the moon and the stars bowed down to him. And what did that mean to the brothers and to even the father and the mother? Well, it meant that the sun and the moon was the mother and the father, and the stars were the brothers. That meant one day that he would rule over them. And that's what it meant. Oftentimes, celestial bodies were used as figurative and symbolic language, and that's why it's used here. And we'll see that just a little later on. But remember that we're still talking about, somebody says, you don't know that now. You're getting out on a limb. Well, I want to tell you that I'm fixing to crawl back to the trunk of the tree and show you with an undeniable verse that I'm right. Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaf, you know that summer is near. That's a sure sign. So you also, when you see all of these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. He's warning his disciples, when you see this, you better get out of Jerusalem and find a safe place to hide. Somebody said, you've got that magic verse? I do, it's right there. You've got that magic verse that's going to get you off of the limb and back to the trunk of the tree? I do. It's the next verse. Assuredly I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. All these things. What about the sun and the moon, the stars, and all of that? All of these things take place. When's it going to happen, Lord? Oh, it's in the future. We're in the 21st century, but it's coming. Every time I read something in the papers about a war or about a horrific earthquake or this, that, and the other, a tidal wave, oh, that's a sign of the times. Don't you believe it? If you hear somebody preaching that, you get away from him because he don't know what he's talking about. Because those signs back there, the Lord said that's not it. That's not the sign of the coming of the Lord is taking vengeance upon Jerusalem. But he did say this, that everything I've told you is going to happen in your generation. Everything. So that got me off the limb, back to the trunk of the tree, didn't it? This generation by no means will pass till all, now all doesn't mean some, all these things shall take place. And so I just tell you, false teachers, just get out of Matthew 24 and get out of Mark 13 and get out of Luke 21. That's not your territory to be preaching these end time things. It's just not yours. And all the other scriptures that we have no time to get into every one of them, but we'll get to them. Generation will no means pass away. Did you know that was in there? Let me be fair with you. I didn't know. I didn't know until someone led me to understand. And I'm trying to lead you to understand. And I'm not being haughty or act as if that I know something that you don't. But that's the truth of it right there. All of these things before, all these things from Matthew 24 and the other passage I mentioned, from verse 1 all the way up to verse 33, he says it's going to happen during your generation. Something to think about. The disciples asked him, when will these things be? They were told this. I say to you that not one stone will be left here upon the other. He was talking about the temple in Jerusalem. So this passage is talking about one city, and it's talking about one temple in Jerusalem. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. He's talking about false prophets and false Christs. and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. He said, that's not a sign. The 21st century preachers ought to listen to that now. And there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. He's telling us that natural disasters will not be a sign. Something to think about, isn't it? Then they will deliver you up for tribulation and kill you. The documentation of the persecution of the church by the Jews and the Romans are well known. That was going to happen. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. There's still false prophets in the world today now. Then again, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a witness. And that happened. What's the gospel? He said, you go into all the world. They did it. You preach the gospel to every creature. They did it. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. Just think about the missionary tours of the apostles. You know, the missionary tours of the Apostle Paul are documented in the book of Acts. But the other apostles weren't just sitting around doing nothing. They were busy too. They carried the gospel to the world. Here's what he said. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. At the end of the world, there's not going to be a mountain to flee to. Let him who is in the housetop not go down and take anything out of the house. Not going to be a concern at the end of the world. Let him who is in the field not go back. When the earth is destroyed, there will be neither mountains to which to run, nor any need for clothing or household goods. Why didn't I see that? When I was first studying the Bible, why didn't I see that? Why did I try to equate all of this to the end of the world? Why didn't I see that? The sun will be darkened. Oh, here's a good one. And the moon will not give its light. You know, look at 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. But this is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel. They said, men and brethren, what is this? What's going on here? It was the beginning of the church. He said, this is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel. I will show wonders in heaven above and the signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. What was happening on the day of Pentecost? He said, this is it. This is that. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and the notable day of the Lord come. And the Apostle Peter preached that in the first sermon. He said, this is that. This is what's happening. When the disciples who asked him, when will these things be, were told, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. You need to worry about it. You'll be here. You'll see it. It's going to happen. I wasn't in that generation. Neither were you. And so we are looking for the end of the world, but none of the things described in the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew, Mark 13, and Luke 21, that's not ours. The things described in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21 were going to happen to that generation and not to our generation. What was going to happen? Destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the false teachers, the persecutions, the gospel of the kingdom would preach to the world. Oh, what about this now? The sun darkened, moon not able to give its light, stars. You remember what I told you a while ago of the symbolic language that is sometimes used, the celestial bodies? Well, right here it is, a figurative description of the destruction of Judaism, a God-given religion, but it was destroyed so that Christianity could take its place, and the Jewish hierarchy. No longer there was going to be the priest, the high priest. No longer was there going to be the annual trips to Jerusalem. Judaism was over. It had served its purpose. It was the schoolmaster that brought us to Christ. And that's what it's talking about, the symbolic destruction or description of the destruction of Judaism and the Jewish hierarchy, so that Christ, as our high priest, could take charge. He's the one. the sun darkened, moon not to give its light. That's what it's talking about, the symbolic language. Somebody says, well, you ain't even touched on Revelation. I have not. But I'm going to tell you something. Revelation is the happy hunting ground of the end time preachers. Anytime something comes up, something unusual across the world, some kind of an explosion, a war, or earthquakes, or pestilence, they jump up and say, oh yeah, look at here. It's over here in the book of Revelation. I have been checking very closely, and it's close to the end of time. He don't know that. It could be. It could happen before I can finish this broadcast. But I don't know if it will or not, and he don't either. But I'm telling you here, I'm showing you the key to Revelation is something that you may never have thought of, but I have. But I used to not think of it because, again, I plead ignorance. I didn't know. But I'm showing you so that you will know. The key to Revelation is so simple. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants, here it comes, things which must shortly take place. What's that now? Oh, I thought now the revelation was projecting itself over into the 21st century. Way out there where that we can grab up a newspaper and look at the headlines and trot off into Revelation and say, oh yeah, that's what Revelation is talking about. He said it must shortly come to pass. You know what? The first century Christians understood Revelation clearly, perfectly. They had no trouble with it. We have to study to find out what the symbolism in there means. Modern day self-appointed prophets must stop trying to put today's headline news in the book of Revelation. It don't fit. It's a perversion of the word. Look at this. Jesus will return. There's no question about it. All nations will be gathered before him. We understand that, don't we? Look here. When will he return? He'll come as a thief in the night. Does the thief call you up? You remember what Jesus said when he was warning them about the destruction of Jerusalem? The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. You remember what he said about the destruction of Jerusalem? Look at this. But know this, that the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come. He would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. We don't know. A thief in the night. Thank you for watching the Seeking the Lost broadcast. This is Earl Barnett saying, you have a good day.
Our God is an awesome God.
You have been watching Seeking the Lost with Earl Barnett. If you need prayer or have comments or questions, feel free to call the Seeking the Lost Ministry at 1-800-390-7734. That's toll free, 1-800-390-7734.